Hello, everyone. This is a call, and what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about the seventh house, Libra, and partnerships. The one thing about the seventh house is, and it can be a little bit confusing, is that sometimes people say, oh, well, the seventh house is related to relationships. And, well, yeah, that's kind of true. Um, but sometimes we think about relationships along the lines of marriage. And I would say that you have to broaden your perspective when we're looking at the seventh house. When we're talking about relationships, we're actually talking about partnerships of all kinds. These could be like legal partnerships, they can be business partnerships, they can be partnerships, obviously the romantic types. Anyway, it can take on all sorts of dynamics because really what we're looking at here is the dynamic between I, the individual, the ego, and the other. Okay, that's how we have to take a look at this house. And any planets that get placed in this house are going to um, create dynamics as they relate to I and the other. So the let's see, how do I explain this? So Libra is a very interesting energy in that um, I've known a lot of Libras, and it took me a really long time to understand the energy of Libra. And I really didn't understand the energy of Libra until I started, I guess, meeting more mature Libras. And then I started seeing how it's actually a very spiritual kind of energy. It's a very high vibration kind of energy. And I know sometimes Libras get called like lazy or, or whatever it is, or hedonists. And there's a lot of like shallow generalizations that we can make about the energy of Libra, which in a lot of cases are true uh, when someone's immature. But we can say that with all the signs, when people are immature, it doesn't come off well. So, and I want to kind of like demonstrate also a little bit about like as we progress towards the seventh house, what exactly is happening. And obviously, the opposition to the seventh house is the first house or the ascendant, and the first house is always represented by the individual, the I. And what establishes, and I shouldn't even say the individual, we'll use the term ego. And it's how does the ego um, I guess, form over time. So the first house represents the sort of most fundamental aspects of who the ego is, those characteristics that we identify as ourselves. And so what you look at with the ascendant is, for instance, I have a Sagittarius ascendant, so I am very philosophical, very high-minded. Um, Also have a lot of nervous energy, et cetera, et cetera. Again, we can make all these generalizations about the ascendant and the ego. But as you start to progress here, so for instance, you go to the second house, what happens in the second house is it becomes less electric in nature and it becomes more magnetic. So it becomes about what we're drawing to us in life in terms of what we desire and what we value. So that could be material things in general or whatever it is. But in the second house, we start to define, the ego defines itself as what it values and what it desires. Third house is about communication. So, how does the ego, the individual, uniquely express itself in terms of communication? Because the expression really comes out in the fifth house. So, fourth house is about the ego's emotional needs. Fifth house would be about the ultimate pinnacle of, I guess, the creative, self-actualized ego comes out in the fifth house. Sixth house is the humbling. So the humbling occurs in Virgo, sixth house. And what I mean by humbling, it has to do with uh, the discernment to perceive where the ego is overinflated. So the ego becomes very overinflated in the fifth house Leo, and then in Virgo, it becomes humbled, and then it becomes about how I serve through work. How do I serve the tribe? How do I serve culture? How do I serve society? Seventh house is much more relational in dynamics. And again, this is Venus energy playing in here, so it's magnetic. These individuals in the seventh house are drawing. Obviously, we're all drawing life towards us. However, In the seventh house, it's about the evolutionary pathway for the individual is dependent in a lot of ways on drawing others towards them. Again, partnerships, relationships, etc., etc. So, without getting into all the specifics about, oh, if Mars is placed there or Saturn is placed there, because that changes the dynamics. However, it always is about the individual is learning about themselves and learning to function objectively, because all the houses prior to that were subjective in nature. So in the seventh house, it becomes objective. It starts to become about comparisons and contrasts of how I compared myself to the other. Now, it requires that the I has lots of different relationships, lots of different partnerships, lots of different dynamics. So hence it becomes this very magnetic energy, uh, and it's about evolutionary energy too, because remember, keep in mind that the seventh house is a cardinal house, meaning it's usually the beginning of a new evolutionary phase or cycle. And I'm going to get to that in a moment, because the soul of Libra is very much about Uranus. So the evolution of the I requires that the I meets lots of individuals, creates lots of connections, lots of partnerships. And what it does, though, is that sometimes there's friction in those relationships. So this might manifest in a number of different ways, because the friction is what actually aids us in growth, right? It's pain, fear, and suffering. Saturn aids our growth, and and again, it can. If we cave to fear, let's say hypothetically, when looking at the planet Saturn, then what ends up happening is that we end up sheltering ourselves and becoming closed off. So that can happen as well when we're talking about Saturn energy. And that is also applies in a lot of ways to the seventh house, which is the individual may have a number of, let's say, unsuccessful relationships, unsuccessful. And what's really important here is that anyone with a lot of energy in the seventh house, Libra sun, Libra moon, whatever it may be, is to understand that there's no failed relationships, okay? The only failure is our individual ability to if we don't perceive growth, right? Every house, every sign is about your spiritual growth ultimately. So if you fail to see the growth in a dynamic, and all you can do is look back at your relationship and say, oh, there was nothing but conflict, oh, I'm a victim, or whatever it is, you failed. The relationship didn't fail, you failed, okay? And I don't mean that to be mean, but it's true, okay? If you're objective and you can look at the dynamic, you can step back, because again, Libra is very intellectual. It can look at the dynamic. The beauty of air signs is the ability to conceptualize something and to perceive it and to look at it. And so using that skill, that Libra energy, that air energy, that intellect, you can look at the relationship, the partnership, whether, again, it could be business, it could be law, it could be romantic, whatever it is. And you can look at how every relationship, partnership in your life evolved you individually. It changed the dynamic of how you relate to yourself even, right? Because, I mean, the purpose of relationships, because relationships are an amazing proving ground. I mean, marriages and all sorts of intimate relationships, they're incredibly transformational, not just because of the mistakes that are made and then the sort of forgiveness that we're, I guess, learning to access, but it's also about the energy dynamics of what happens when you have two individuals who come into close proximity. What ends up happening is that the auras, the energy bodies of these two individuals intertwine. And this intertwining of energy creates the we. All right. So the the failure of the I, and I'm using the term failure, and I mean that very loosely. Uh, the failure of the I when it comes to, again, understanding what happened with the we that supposedly failed is what can end up happening is we learn to identify ourselves as the relationship. So I think the term is codependence. I may be misusing that term. It was a pretty trendy term a while back, and I don't know that I ever grasped it completely, but it sounds like codependence to me. So where it's like all of a sudden, oh, I'm not me without this other person, right? It's ridiculous. It's because the person identified themselves as the relationship, which is problematic because how we are learning to identify ourselves on the material plane is through inner authority. Okay, it's through the inner workings. It's through, again, this idea with what's happening with Libra is to objectively see the relationships and the partnerships and to be able to digest them through comparison, through contrast, through relating. And once they're able to do that, they can see how I stand out from the we. I hope that makes sense. So um, let's see what else here. So ultimately, like I said, the friction that can happen in relationships, that's for your growth. And again, there's no victims here. The only victims here is if we're a victim of ourselves, and if we fail to let go of victimhood. So keep that in mind. I'm a Pisces. I talk a lot about victimhood. So the one of the more interesting things about Libra energy, the seventh house energy, is particularly. I'm going to talk about the sign of Libra more specifically here for a moment, which is the evolution of the soul of a Libra native. And again, when we're talking about Libra energy, we're looking at the moon primarily, the sun, and the ascendant. So if you have Libra on in any of those placements, this kind of applies to you on a lot of levels. Libra, as they connect to their soul on their evolutionary pathways, they become to spiritualize and start to see how their partnerships or how they evolve in a lot of ways. What ends up happening is they become Uranian in nature. And what do I mean by that? It's, again, the process is about individuation. Uranus is the planet of individuation. Uranus, they say, oh, it's sudden energy. Well, it's sudden energy to shock the system, right? And it can shock government systems. It can shock all sorts of systems. It can shock, but in this particular case, we're talking about how it shocks the individual system. And I like to think of it again as like a catharsis that happens within the emotional body or within the nervous system. But Uranus, what it'll do is it creates sudden changes, sudden situations in which the individual is forced to change their path or their perspective in some particular way. And what that changes towards as it applies to a deeper Libra, because superficially, I mean, we're going to go real superficial. Superficially, Libra can be really shallow, really shallow. All sorts of like, oh, I like high fashion goods. Again, the most cliche of shallow you can see in immature Libra. As Libra matures, again, the ability to see the dynamic between how the ego is defined, how the I is defined relative to partnerships and connections, and they can see the growth and how it occurs. Then what ends up happening is Libra connects to the intuition. It connects to the depths. It goes into the soul in a lot of ways. And so once they access their soul, it's about revolutionary in a lot of ways. But revolutionary in what sense? Are these people going to be leading revolutions and this and that and everything else? Not necessarily, but a revolutionary in the sense of they can see how different ways of connecting to the other can be modified over time, can be changed over time so that it better suits where humanity is now, right? So thinking about the planet that's associated with the Aquarian age, like we've moved into the Aquarian age. So we're talking about Uranian energy, that it's becoming fully expressed in our culture, in our society, and the world around us. Meaning that a lot of the ancient structures, and I mean ancient, if you think like the monetary system, we'll use that particular structure for a moment. The monetary system is a way in which the I relates to the other, right? Transactionally. And that particular system will be falling apart and is currently falling apart. How money is perceived, how money is controlled. We're starting to see, let's say, cryptocurrencies coming up, and all these different ways in which transactions will be different in the future. So that is a very Aquarian age, is a very Uranian thing that's happening. So we have yet to hit the Uranian point of collapse, though, the sudden change moment. We've just had this buildup, right? So Uranus also represents technology. So we're seeing these cryptocurrencies come up. We're seeing different ways in which we perceive money. All that's changing, right? So through this process of change, eventually, like I said, new revolutionary structures will come into being. Now, Libra, again, being very much about the sort of intimacy, the relating to the other, you can see all sorts of very interesting revolutionary ways in which these individuals create dynamics in their relationships. Um, yeah, I don't want to go into too much detail regarding that because, I mean, you can think about all the different ways in which we organize ourselves, but this is not about particular ideologies, because reality is that the ideologies, whether it's socialism, communism, or any of these ways in which we organize ourselves, are actually very much part of the past. They're remnants. We don't even know what's coming, right? And maybe it's an amalgamation of many different ideologies all kind of mixed up in our future. Who knows? But the reality is that a Libra individual, they're here to perceive that. And they're here to, in a lot of ways, on an evolutionary level, to help guide us towards that. And so if you have planets in the seventh house, those planets mean that you are participating in this evolution, this new way in which humanity, the individual, the ego, is relating to the group dynamic. And well, less about the group dynamic and more about the other in general. Um, and again, this tends to be, because this is not the 11th house, this is more about personal dynamics. But nonetheless, you can see how personal dynamics ultimately end up reflecting the whole in a lot of different ways. Like if you live in a society that's, say, Christian based, then the whole idea of monogamous marriage is going to be what's generally held by society as true. So the individual may organize themselves in that way, but they're reflecting the society, and the society reflects the individual. So the 7th house and the 11th house have a very interesting relationship in this regard. I don't want to belabor this or make it too confusing. So with that, all that said, I hope that you understand, Libra a little bit better. Just keep in mind the two things is that the I is learning to balance itself with the we. So in other words, it's letting go of a lot of the self-sacrifice in some ways. It's learning to identify itself through relating to others. And again, this is about a path and a progression. So if you're young on your sort of path as a Libra, or you have a lot of Libra energy, be very patient. And again, keep in the back of your mind the idea that it's all about your spiritual growth. Don't push away relationships just because they didn't work for you in the past, right? If something didn't work for you in the past, this are quote unquote failures are there to show us, I guess, like warning signs of, hey, this particular relationship reminds me of another relationship I had, so I know not to go there. So that would be one way in which we sort of are able to mature in our progression. But nonetheless, if you have 7th house energy, Libra, or whatever, it is all about you as defined by the we. So with that said, appreciate it. Thank you much.